Right, so as you saw in the last video, deleting exercises is really not a big deal. Now, what about editing existing exercises? What I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to clone this element over here. I'm just going to paste it in. I'm going to delete the, delete icon. And I'm going to go back to material.io/icons. That's the website for Google's material icons. What I'm going to do is I'm going to search for the edit icon. If you scroll down, you're actually going to find this beautiful pen that we can use. So the name of this icon is edit. If we go back, we could just simply use it with the camel case as always. And the edit icon needs to be imported from Material UI icons as well. So now we have this beautiful icon. And of course the on-click handler is also going to change. So we're going to switch from on-delete to, let's call it on-select edit. We're going to have to pass the ID to that method as well. And in fact, that method doesn't exist even yet, so I'm going to add it to the list of properties. And finally, we're going to need to pass it to the component from within the app root component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this handle exercise, let's do select edit. Okay, so we need to add that method as well. Let's add it at the bottom. We'll have an ID, and then finally what we're going to do is, let's set state. And then for the set state call, what we can actually do is we can actually add a new property. Let's call it edit mode, and it'll be set to true. Now the idea here is that when you click on the edit mode icon, it's going to open up the form, basically the same form as you saw in the previous videos, the one for creating a new exercise. It's going to display that form on the right pane so that we can actually modify the title, description, as well as the muscles for a given exercise. So we're going to set the value of that property on the state to true, but we also need to update the selected exercise, right? Because when you click on this button, you're going to need to select an exercise, pretty much the same way as we already do when you click on the list item itself. We're also going to do the same thing that this property does in the end. So in app.js, it refers to handle exercise select to this method. So what we need to do is we basically in the end need to do pretty much the same thing by updating the selected exercise. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste it back in, but we need to update the edit mode property to true. And to be clear, you could also set the edit mode to false as the initial value on the state. So you could set it to false. But if you don't set it to false, it's actually going to be undefined. And in the end, it's also going to be falsy. So you can keep it out from the state just for the sake of brevity. So I'm going to scroll back here. And in fact, because we just have a single set state call, we don't actually need the curly braces. We're not actually returning anything from the method. I'm going to do the same thing for all of the other ones. So I'm going to kill all of those unnecessary curly braces. Let's do the same thing over here. Gonna take a few seconds. Okay, that's better. So we simplified the code base slightly. Now, of course, in this case, if I click on edit, it's going to, it's not going to display anything because we did not update the logic over here for the right pane. So the one thing we could do is inside of the paper component, what we can say is basically the following. So let's say if we do have the edit mode property enabled. So if edit mode is true, then what we're going to do is we're actually going to display something, right? In this case, we'd like to display a form. And this form would contain the title, description, and muscle fields, just like the form that we have when you click on the plus icon to create a new exercise. It's going to be the exact same form. And otherwise, we could just simply display a fragment, so an empty wrapper, which could also be a div, of course, but I'll use a fragment. And otherwise, we basically just display the two typography elements inside of it. So I'll just paste them inside the fragment. Okay, and then the problem here, of course, is that edit mode is not defined. So I'm going to expect the edit mode property to be passed with the props. Let's save that. And then the edit mode, of course, that needs to come from the app component. Let's reference edit mode, and the edit mode is going to come from the state. So again, the edit mode property basically just indicates whether we are in the edit mode. And what I mean by edit mode is a mode in which the form is being displayed and you're basically able to modify the fields of the selected exercise. So that's the whole idea. So I'm going to save app.js, and of course this is not going to work still because we're referencing a form which is not really an existing element. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to do a bit of refactoring here. Back in the dialog create.js file, we already have the form nested inside of the modal over here. And the one thing that I actually mentioned in the description of one of my videos is that it's kind of weird that we have the exercise model nested inside of the state on the dialog, because the dialog should not really be concerned with the exercise, so this property is sort of like off on the state. It would be better to extract it to a separate component which will in the end be responsible for handling it. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to actually create a new file. Let's call it form.js, and this form.js will basically, of course, as always, it's going to import React from React. This will be a component, and we're basically going to export default a class. The type of pattern that I like to follow for this file is known as a controlled component. So a controlled component is basically a component that contains its own state, and it's responsible for maintaining its own state. In this example, the component that I'd like to create for the form would basically be the form that we have inside of the dialog, of course. So I'm just going to minimize this, and I'm going to grab the form, I'm going to paste it in here, and in fact we're going to need to create the render method first. So let's return the form. We're going to paste it in, and then we're going to need to also extract all of these other guys, the imports from Material UI, just so that we're able to reference those elements inside of the form component. And then back in create.js, what we can actually do is we can basically go back to this place and put the form inside of it. And of course we're going to need to pass some of the properties as well. So what the form actually expects to have is it expects to have the categories, which, if you remember, are basically muscles. In fact, we can actually extract this line from create.js because we no longer need to manipulate the muscles or the categories. I'm going to paste it in here. This is going to be a constant. We're basically extracting the classes and the muscles of the props, and in fact the classes, well, that refers to the styles that we created in the last video. So I'm going to paste them in here. So let's have these styles, and we're going to need to remove the with styles call as well. Let's paste it in here. I'm going to close off the class, and then with styles, well, that needs to be included inside of form.js as always. So the refactoring is a bit boring, of course, but if you stick with it, it's going to get more enticing in just a few minutes. So what else are we missing here? Well, the exercise itself, that's going to be gone because the form is going to be responsible for maintaining the state on the exercise. So I'm just going to cut that state. Let's create a new state property. Looks like I made a typo. Of course, this const extraction or destructuring from the props, that needs to be inside of the render method. So we're going to have our initial state over here, and then back in here we're going to need to cut all these methods, the handle on change, handle submit. They're no longer relevant to the dialog, so I'm going to paste them in here. Okay, and of course we're going to need to change a few things. So we're no longer updating the exercise on the state, we're actually updating the property directly. So I'm going to delete that. What the method here is going to do, well, it's very simple. It's just basically going to update the property that has a name of name coming off this variable, and then it's going to update the state for that property. So I'm just going to remove the curly braces, which we don't actually need in this case. And it looks like something is breaking in create.js. Let's see. We have a fragment with a button, with a dialog, and the form. I don't think we ever included the form, so let's import form from form. In fact, let's actually, yeah, in this case we need to go up to get the form. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move create to exercises, and in this case I'm going to delete the dialogues folder, and I'm going to remove create to just simply dialog.js, like that. This is going to break the import in header. So what I'll do is I'll change it to dialog. And this is going to come from exercises dialog, like that. In fact, we can keep it as create dialog. Just for clarity, the name of the default export is basically up to you. So we'll keep it as create dialog. And then this is coming from exercises dialog, so it should be good. Let's refresh this. I'm going to go back to dialog, and we have something on line 58. Oh, I forgot the closing parenthesis right there. Component is not defined. This one is coming from here, from the form. We're extending the component, but we forgot to import it, so I'll include the component as well as the fragment, which I think we're going to need at some point. Probably not. If we do need it, I'm going to include it. What else? We have this constant over here that's coming from the state. That's no longer applicable. We only are going to have the open property. And what else? Text field is not defined. Well, these two are coming from Material UI as well. I'm going to cut them. I'm going to paste them back in here. In fact, we're going to need to create another import for the text field, for the select, but also the button. If you remember, we used to have the button at the end of the form. In fact, we included it in dialog actions. Now, the problem with that is that the button always needs to be present on the form, whether you're creating an exercise or you are editing an existing one. But the dialog is only applicable when you create a new exercise, but not when you edit. So the button, like I said, always needs to be there. I'm just going to cut it and I'm going to paste it at the end over here after a break. And the button, like I said, would need to be imported as well from Material UI, like that, without next, just Material UI. And then here we can just get rid of dialog actions, like that. And then the dialog actions can also be killed from there, okay. And then lastly, in form.js, what we need to do is we also need to extract the title, description, as well as the muscles of the state. So that's what I'm going to do. And then we can also keep the other ones that we extract from the props, like that. And then to map through the categories, well, of course, we're going to need to pass them down to exercises. So what I'll do is I'll pass the muscles from app.js, like that. The muscles, if you remember, they basically refer to the muscles at the very top coming directly from the store. We're going to pass them down to exercises, and then the exercises component is going to need to receive them through props. We're going to do muscles, so these muscles over here, they need to be passed to the form as well. So what I'll do is I'll pass the muscles down to the form component, like that. And then the last thing we're going to need to do is we're also going to need to include the submit handler. So in this case, what we can do is the handle submit function is going to call the onCreate prop. But because we want to keep it generic for both of the cases, when you create an exercise but also when you edit it, let's change it to onSubmit, like that. The onSubmit is going to need to come from index.js, from this file. So we'll do onSubmit. We're going to call onEdit, which is a new property that we have to create. So we'll add it to the list of props in there. onEdit needs to be also added incidentally to app.js, of course. So let's do onEdit. Let's create a new method. We're going to call it handle exercise edit. Then we need to create the method, of course. So at the end of the list, I'm going to add a new one. And this one's going to accept the exercise as well. And then we're going to set the state, most likely. And when the exercise is edited, well, what we need to do is we need to pass a callback, as we always do. And this callback is going to accept the previous state from which we're going to extract the exercises, like that. The idea here is that when the exercise changes, so when we receive the new updated exercise object, what we're going to do is we're going to get the exercises, and we're going to filter them down to the exercises that don't contain the current exercise that's been edited. So we'll do when the ID does not equal to exercise ID. And then once we get that, so I'm going to cut it actually, what I'll do is I'm actually going to extract all of those elements to a new array, and then we're just basically going to append the new exercise to that array. So what that actually is going to do is it's going to find all of the exercises that don't have the ID of this exercise that we accept as the argument. It's going to filter them down, and then it's going to add the new exercise object to the end of the new array. And then everything else is going to be recalculated, and then you're going to see the updated exercise in the list on the left. Now, back in Dialog.js, in this scenario, we're actually going to need to pass the muscles, of course. These muscles actually come from header. So what we could do here is let's actually extract them from the props. So what I'll do is I'm going to get the muscles from the props like that. We'll pass the muscles as the muscles property down to the form component. And the form component is also going to need to accept the onSubmit property, which would refer to onCreate property coming from the header. So let's also destructure that from the props. I'll bring back the indentation to what it was before. Let's save it. Let's not forget to include the form in index.js as well. So form from form, it exists in the same directory. So now when you click on the edit icon or the pen icon, that's actually going to open up the form. But because we've set the width to 500, it's actually not being displayed correctly. So let's change it to 300 perhaps. Well, it looks better. But of course, as you can see here, it doesn't actually populate the form because we did not provide any initial value into it. So the one thing we can do here is instead of setting the state to the properties that just simply refer to empty strings, what we can do here is let's actually create a method, getInitialState. And this method is going to do the following. It's going to try to destructure an exercise from the props, okay, from this props. And on the same note, we're actually going to pass that exercise in index.js to the form. So what I'll do is I'm going to pass the exercise object down to the form. So let's do exactly that, exercise, that. And this exercise refers to the currently selected exercise that basically exists on the state. And it gets updated whenever the exercise is being selected. So when you click on the list item, for example, the exercise is being selected. But when you click on the edit icon, the exercise is also being selected, because that's exactly what we do inside of setState. We're finding the exercise on the exercises array, and then we're updating the currently selected exercise to that exercise that we're able to find based on the ID that's being provided. And the ID, in case you forgot, it's coming from index.js over here when we call the onSelectEdit method. So back in form.js, we can expect the exercise object on the props, and once we do get it, we can actually return either the exercise if we do have it, or we can just simply return an object that will contain all those properties like that. So when we're setting the state, the initial state on the form, we can actually call getInitState method like that, and this would either return the exercise, so the properties of the exercise, be title, description, and muscles, or just an empty object if that exercise is not available, which is the case when you open up the create exercise modal. And in this case, we need to fix it to this getInitialState. Let's try that again. That's what the form is going to look like. We don't have any initial values. That's why we get this empty object over here. But if I click on the edit icon, let's say for bench press, now we get an error. The exercise is not defined. And that's because the exercise, let's see, we never extracted from the props. So let's actually destructure it as well. And I'll keep this one in there for now as well. Let's save it. Let's click on the edit icon again. As you can see here, it pre-populates the form with the values. So in this case, I clicked on bench press, we've got the title, the muscles, and we've got the description as well.